Nobody photographs the moment before the photograph. They get the wave, the white gloves, the practiced smile, the whole machinery of grace assembled so carefully it almost looks effortless. What they don't get is the 2 seconds before, when someone in the room shifts their weight wrong, or a hand reaches where it shouldn't, or a child goes very still in the particular way that children go still when something in the air has changed and their body understood it before their mind caught up. I've stood in that gap before. That 2-second gap. It is not a comfortable place to stand. I am not a man given to drama. 15 years on royal detail will do that to you. Sand you down to smooth stone, train out the flinch, the blink, the tells. You learn to be furniture, expensive, watchful furniture. You learn the difference between a scene and a situation, between ceremony and crisis. You learn that most of what looks dangerous isn't, and most of what looks fine isn't. This is about the day I stopped being furniture. This is about a little girl who held herself together with the dignity of someone 3 times her age. About a room that smiled for the cameras and bled behind the curtains. About the thing no one official will confirm and no one who was there will forget. And I was standing 4 feet from Princess Charlotte when Camilla reached for her. What happened next took 11 seconds. This is my account of those 11 seconds, and every terrible, quiet minute that built toward them. The ballroom at Clarence's house smells like cut lilies and old money and something underneath both of those things. Something older, institutional. The way certain buildings absorb the weight of everything conducted inside them over decades until the walls themselves begin to feel pressurized. I know that smell. I've spent half my adult life in it. My name is Davies, just Davies. In this work, first names are a liability, a thing someone can use to make you feel human at the wrong moment. I have been on personal protection detail for the British royal family since I was 31 years old. I am 46 now. My left knee predicts rain with more accuracy than the Met Office. I have a habit of counting exits in any room I enter, not as a professional exercise anymore, but as compulsion, the way some men check their watches. It calms me. It is possibly a problem. I have not asked anyone to confirm this. The event was a private reception, intimate, in the vocabulary of palace communications, which means 63 people instead of 400, dignitaries, patrons, a scattering of press, pre-vetted, corralled behind a velvet rope near the east windows, where the light was flattering and the angles were controlled. Everything about the afternoon had been engineered. The flower arrangements chosen to photograph beautifully at a distance, the children's appearance timed for exactly 20 minutes, structured enough to produce the right images, and brief enough to prevent the kind of authentic child behavior that ruins carefully managed narratives. Charlotte was 9, and I want to be precise about that because it matters. 9 years old carries a specific gravity that 8 does not. Old enough to understand the performance, young enough to still feel the cost of it in real time. She walked in with her mother and her brother beside the Prince of Wales, and she moved the way I'd seen her move a dozen times before. That particular carriage she'd developed, shoulders back and chin level, not stiff, but contained. It like something small and alive, held inside a very deliberate stillness. She found the room with her eyes before she found her position in it. She always did that. I noticed the dress first. Pale blue, long-sleeved, the kind of garment designed to photograph like watercolor. Then I noticed her hands. She was holding them together in front of her, left thumb working slow circles against her right palm. It was not visible from the press rope. It was not a thing the cameras would catch. But I was 4 feet away and I caught it. She was working very hard to be fine. I filed it, kept scanning. The reception moved the way these things move, a kind of choreographed drift, clusters forming and dissolving, the low hum of conversation careful enough to never rise to anything. Everyone's voice pitched to convey ease without actually achieving it. I held my position near the south wall, one step behind and slightly left of where Charlotte stood with her mother, close enough to matter, far enough to be wallpaper. Camilla arrived from the connecting room at 17 minutes past the hour. I had seen the Duchess, the Queen Consort, protocol insists, though in my head the title still sits slightly wrong. The way a picture hung slightly crooked will bother you forever even once you've stopped looking directly at it. I had seen her in dozens of settings over the years. She is not a small presence. She moves through a room with the confidence of someone who has survived things the room does not know about, which I respect, genuinely. That survival has a particular texture. I recognized it. It takes one to know one. She crossed toward the family grouping, and the configuration of the room shifted around her the way configurations always shift around someone with enough title and intention. Charlotte's mother moved slightly to receive her. Charlotte did not move. This was the first thing. It was subtle. The kind of subtle that wouldn't register as data to anyone who hadn't spent 15 years reading bodies in rooms. Charlotte did not step back. She did not stiffen. She simply became, in a way I cannot fully articulate, more present in her own position, rooted, like a child who had decided, without announcement, that she was standing exactly here and intended to continue doing so. Camilla spoke to the Princess of Wales first. The usual warmth, the ceremonial affection, and the careful tenderness of a relationship built in public over many years with all the usual complications running underneath it like current. I wasn't positioned to hear the specific words. I didn't need to. The body language was its own language. Then she turned toward Charlotte. And Charlotte, 9 years old, blue dress, a thumb still working that slow circle against her palm, looked up at her with an expression I had never seen on a child's face before and have not been able to stop thinking about since. It was not hostility. It was assessment, the pure, unornamented appraisal of someone who had decided to think for themselves about who deserved what and was in the process of arriving at a conclusion. Camilla said something. Charlotte responded. 3 words, maybe 4, short, polite, and containing, in the specific way that short, polite responses can contain. An absolute wall. I felt something shift in my chest. I filed it again. The next 12 minutes proceeded normally. The photographer circled. The children performed their prescribed charm at intervals. The charming children images captured and logged and approved. George drifted toward the refreshment table and was gently redirected. Charlotte remained where she was. The thumb had stopped its circling. Whatever decision she had been computing had apparently been computed. It was when the formal photography portion concluded and the press were ushered toward the east corridor that the geometry of the room changed. The engineered structure of the afternoon came apart in the specific way that endings of events come apart. People relaxing slightly, conversations becoming more genuine, children ceasing to be props and becoming just children again, fidgeting toward their handlers, or tugging softly at sleeves. Charlotte moved to retrieve something from the table at the room's edge. A small leather journal she carried, the kind of unnecessary but personally essential object that children attach enormous significance to, and adults learn to stop attaching significance to, which is its own kind of loss. She was 3 steps from her mother. Camilla was 2 steps from her. The hand came out, not aggressively, not maliciously. The movement read as natural, reaching. The instinct to guide, to steer, the way adults reach for children's arms in rooms as a reflexive grammar of authority, fingers extended toward Charlotte's upper arm, closing the distance. Charlotte saw it coming, and she turned her body, not dramatically, not with retreat. She turned it the way a door turns on a hinge, using only the minimum geometry required to ensure the hand found nothing. It found nothing. The whole thing took perhaps 2 seconds. Nobody in the room would have named it. Nobody was positioned to name it. The cameras were gone, except for me, and except for the guard standing near the north column, A colleague of mine, younger, recently reassigned to expanded royal protection. His name was Hargrove. I'll come back to Hargrove, whose head turned 1 degree toward the exchange at exactly the moment Charlotte completed her turn. Our eyes met across the room for approximately half a second. We did not acknowledge each other. There was nothing to acknowledge. The room continued, smiling. Charlotte collected her journal, tucked it under her arm with the small solemnity of a scholar retrieving a critical text, and walked back to her position beside her mother without looking behind her. The thumb had not resumed its circles. She didn't need them anymore. Whatever she had decided it completely, and she was carrying it with both hands. And nobody in the room who was looking at the pretty photographs would ever know the weight of what she was holding. I watched her walk, and I thought about 9 years old, and I thought about the exits. There were 4. I had known this since before the lilies were arranged. Hargrove's given name was Thomas, but I had called him Hargrove since the day he joined Expanded Detail, because in this work, you are your surname and your function, and the gap between those two things is where you store everything you cannot afford to feel during operating hours. He was 29. Built like a question mark, tall and slightly forward-leaning as if permanently anticipating the next thing, which in this job is either an asset or an early sign of burnout, and the difference between those two outcomes is mostly luck and sleep. He had a habit of touching the radio on his hip when he was thinking, not checking it, just touching it, the way some people press a bruise. He was good at his job. Not remarkable, not yet, but solid in the particular way that solid matters more than brilliant in rooms where brilliant gets people hurt. I had been watching Hargrove for 3 months, quietly. The way I watched all new assignments, not with suspicion, not with mentorship, with the detached, ongoing assessment of someone who needed to know exactly who was standing 2 steps behind him in any given situation. What I had concluded was this: Hargrove had good instincts and had not yet learned to fully trust them. That afternoon was going to change both of those things. The reception was winding down in the way formal events wind down, not with conclusion, but with dissolution, and people finding coats and reasons, the room thinning at the edges first and then at the center. Charlotte and George had been collected by their personal aide and were being guided toward the private corridor that connected to the family wing, a procedure I had participated in enough times to run in my sleep. Simple, transactional, completed in under 4 minutes on a normal afternoon. This was not fully a normal afternoon, and the complication arrived in the form of a small organizational misfiring, the kind of thing that happens in large households when the left hand doesn't quite know what the right hand arranged 30 minutes ago. Charlotte's aide, a young woman named Pemberton, who had been managing the children's schedule for 8 months and was generally competent, had received a last-minute communication redirecting her toward a second-floor anteroom where a family photographer wanted to capture some informal shots before the light changed. This was legitimate. It was also poorly timed. It meant that for approximately 6 minutes, the children's corridor transition existed in a gap between formal escort and casual supervision, the kind of gap that only becomes a problem when something wants to use it. George went ahead with a secondary aide. Charlotte paused in the corridor entrance to wait for Pemberton, who was still receiving her redirected instructions across the room, and in the process of pausing became, for those 6 minutes, the most unsupervised she had been all afternoon. I was repositioning toward the west side of the room when I registered the shift. It runs through the body before it arrives in the mind, the particular recalibration of threat assessment when a principle is unanchored. Nothing alarming. Not yet. But I altered my trajectory. Hargrove had already altered his. I saw him move before I fully understood why he was moving, which is the thing I will not forget about what he did. It was instinct running slightly ahead of protocol, The response of someone who had looked at the room and felt something wrong about its geometry and had moved on that feeling before his training had time to frame it in the correct procedural language. He was at the corridor entrance in 4 steps. Positioning himself, not obtrusively, not with any theater, just there, at the natural anchor point, where someone would have to pass him to reach Charlotte. He did it with the practiced invisibility of good protection work, becoming part of the architecture, and if you hadn't been watching him cross the room, you would have believed he had always been standing exactly there. What happened next, I am going to describe carefully, because the accounts that have circulated since, the rumors, the speculations, the overheated versions of this story that exist in certain corners of certain conversations, have made it both more and less than it was, and neither distortion honors what actually occurred. Camilla had not left the room. She was near the east windows, in conversation with one of the patrons, a genuine conversation, attentive, the kind of engagement she is genuinely good at, which she is, whatever else is complicated. I am trying to be precise here, not partisan. And she was not lurking. She was not scheming. She was at an event that was ending, and she was doing what people do when events end. She looked toward the corridor, saw Charlotte standing alone at its entrance, and moved toward her. Again, I want to be exact about this. The movement was not hostile. The instinct read as care, as the attending to a child reflex, as the reaching toward that adults perform automatically in the presence of an unaccompanied child. It was natural. It would have looked natural to anyone in the room without full context, but Charlotte had already gone still again with that specific stillness, and Hargrove was already in position, and context was doing a great deal of heavy lifting in the next 3 seconds. What Hargrove did was this. He stepped to the side, not toward Camilla, not in front of her, not with any aggressive geometry. He simply stepped in a way that, if you were walking toward that specific point in the corridor, and would require you to redirect your approach, a half step, barely visible. He turned his attention slightly toward Charlotte and said, in a voice calibrated for exactly this kind of moment, quiet enough to avoid theater, present enough to anchor. "Miss, Pemberton's ready for you now," which was not strictly accurate. Pemberton was still across the room, but Charlotte heard it, and she moved. She walked into the corridor with her journal under her arm and her chin level, and she did not look back. Camilla stopped where she was. She was perhaps 12 feet from the corridor entrance when Charlotte disappeared into it. She stood there for a moment. And here I am going to tell you something that did not make it into any version of this story I have heard repeated since, something I noticed because I was watching everything. She stood there, and then something in her expression shifted into something I did not entirely know how to read. It was not anger. I have seen anger on powerful faces. I know its architecture. This was more complicated than anger. Whatever it was, she smoothed it back into her public face in under 2 seconds. She turned back toward the east windows. She resumed her conversation. The room continued its dissolution. Hargrove held his position until the corridor was clear, and then drifted back toward his assigned quadrant as if the last 3 minutes had been unremarkable. He did not look at me. I did not look at him. I was thinking about the expression on his face during those 3 seconds. Not the professional mask, but underneath it, in the fraction of a moment before the training reasserted. And what I had seen underneath was this: not righteousness, not the satisfaction of intervention, but something quieter and more serious. He had looked afraid, not of the situation, of getting it wrong, of being the person who misread the room and caused an incident by responding to something that was only ever nothing, of putting a 12-foot reach of good instinct on record and being wrong. He had moved anyway. I thought about that for a long time after. I thought about 9 years old and blue dresses and the particular courage of moving into a corridor instead of standing still and waiting to see what the room decided to do with you. I thought about Hargrove's hand touching the radio on his hip, and the question mark lean of him, and the way good instinct with the courage to trust itself is one of the rarest things I have encountered in 15 years of rooms like this one. The light through the east windows went the color of old brass. The lilies had begun to smell like themselves instead of like ceremony. I found the north exit. Pemberton collected Charlotte 3 floors up, in an anteroom with good afternoon light. And the photographs from that session were later described by the family's communications team as candid and warm. They were candid. They were warm. They were also taken approximately 22 minutes after a corridor exchange that nobody photographed in a room that had stopped smiling. I logged the day's events in the format required. Standard incident notation, language flat and procedural, stripped of everything I've written here, everything I felt. Submitted at end of shift, filed. Archived in the specific place where things that cannot officially be named are stored in the vocabulary of officially named institutions. I added nothing personal to the log. I never do. But I kept a second record. I always do. 3 weeks later, Hargrove was reassigned. Not demoted, not disciplined, not anything you could point to with language that would hold up in a grievance filing. He was simply moved, absorbed into a different rotation with different principles at a different residence. He's the way water moves around a stone seamlessly without disturbing the surface, the kind of institutional maneuver that requires no memo because everyone involved understands the vocabulary. I found out on a Tuesday. He was gone by Thursday. He didn't say anything to me before he left. I didn't say anything to him. We had never spoken about the corridor. We had never, in any official or unofficial capacity, acknowledged that we had made eye contact across a ballroom and understood each other across 12 feet of polished floor. In this work, you do not narrate what you've seen. You carry it. The carrying is the job. But I noticed his absence the way I notice exits, automatically, cataloged, filed in the part of the mind that tracks what's been subtracted from a room. I am going to tell you what I have not told anyone in 3 years. In the 48 hours after the reception, I went back over my notes. Not the official log, the second record, the handwritten one I keep in a small black notebook that I will probably burn before I retire. Not out of guilt, but out of the specific professional instinct that anything written in your own hand is a liability you are choosing to carry. And I sat with what I had seen. And what I had seen, stripped of every possible alternative interpretation, stripped of benefit of every considerable doubt. I was this. A child had decided something, not been told something, not been coached into something, not performed a reaction she'd rehearsed. She had stood in a room full of adults with their careful warmth and their diplomatic textures and their long, complicated histories compressed into 63 people and a velvet rope, and she had arrived, through her own assessment, at her own conclusion, and she had acted on it. 9 years old, the thumb working circles, the journal under her arm. I am not a sentimental man. 15 years will do that to you, or I will tell myself it will, which is the lie that makes the work sustainable. I have seen grief in rooms like this. I have seen the particular grief of children who understand more than they should and carry it in their bodies in the specific way that carried weight eventually changes posture, changes walk. It changes the set of the jaw over years until what you're looking at is not just the person, but the sum total of everything they've absorbed and not been allowed to put down. I have seen that grief get managed and choreographed and photographed and presented as something else. I have seen it in many rooms. I have stood 4 feet from it and been furniture. What I could not stop returning to. What kept pulling me back to the black notebook. To the incomplete sentences I'd written at midnight with the particular compulsive urgency of a man trying to nail something live to the page before it got away from him, was not the corridor. Not Hargrove's half-step. Not even Camilla's smoothed expression, complicated as it was. It was the moment before all of it. The moment Charlotte arrived in the room, found it with her eyes before finding her position in it, and stood with her chin level and her thumb working its careful circle, and was so visibly, so entirely, in the process of deciding who she was going to be in that room. Not who she was going to perform, who she was going to be. 9 years old with the weight of everything she'd been born into, pressing down on her from every direction, the history of it, the public nature of it, the impossible ongoing demand of it. And she was still in there, still deciding, still running her own assessment of a room full of adults who had already decided what she was. I thought about Hargrove moving before his training caught up to his instinct. I thought about what it costs to trust what you see when what you see does not match what you've been trained to name. The reassignment landed on him 3 weeks later. He didn't fight it. He wouldn't. That's not how it works, and he knew how it worked, which is part of what made him good at his job, and also, in this specific instance, part of what made the whole thing land the way it landed. He packed his kit from the locker room on a Thursday morning and took the transit rotation, and that was that. The room absorbed his absence the way it had absorbed everything else. I kept his position in my head, though, the north column, the natural anchor, the geometry of a half-step that required no violence, no confrontation, no elevation to incident, just a body in a place and a quiet sentence that wasn't quite accurate. I sent a 9-year-old who moved into a corridor with her journal under her arm. Pemberton sent me a message 4 months after. Not about the event, about Charlotte generally, the professional shorthand that circulates between people who work in proximity to the same principles over years. It was brief, efficient, the kind of message that conveys more in the format than the content. She's good, it said. That was all. I understood. Good, in the vocabulary of this work, is the highest compliment available. Not remarkable, not celebrated, not the subject of any carefully managed photographs. Good. Holding, continuing to arrive in rooms and find them with her eyes and stand with her chin level and make her own assessments. Still deciding, still in there. I closed the black notebook that night. Not permanently. I'm not built for clean endings, none of us are. But for a while. Long enough. The way you close a window when a room is finally aired out, and the temperature inside matches the temperature of everything outside. I did not burn it. I thought about Hargrove. He had moved on a feeling he couldn't fully name and paid the procedural price of being right in a place where being right was not the point. He had stood in a gap for 11 seconds, and then spent 3 weeks watching the institution rearrange itself around those 11 seconds until the gap was sealed and the geometry looked normal again, and there was nothing left visible to name. That is what institutions do. That is what rooms like this do. That is also, I think, why the people who stand in gaps for 11 seconds matter in a way that never makes it into the official log. I counted the exits in my apartment that night before I turned off the light. Force of habit. There were 2. I have known this since I moved in. Some things you count because you have to. Some things you count because the counting is the only way to hold the shape of a room that keeps rearranging itself when you're not looking. Charlotte will be older now. She is still deciding. I know this the way I know about the knee and the rain. Some data you gather from instruments. Some you carry in the body.